let's get into it. Okay. All right. So, hey everybody, I'm your host for tonight's Fireside Chat event. I'm Jonathan Jennings, and our Black and Game team wants to welcome you to our Fireside Chat event. And thank you for spending tonight with us and our community as we learn from industry expert Nick Barlow. To introduce Nick, Nick is a software engineer with over 7 years of industry experience. He was at one point the development lead of Chosen Fate. He worked at Microsoft on a lot of low-level rendering APIs, and currently he works on the platform team for Valorant. So everybody, give Nick a round of a hand, and thank you so much for popping up on our Discord, Nick.
How's it going, folks? Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm a huge fan of the community that y'all have built here, and just happy to maybe do my part and just kind of share whatever little knowledge I've accumulated over the years.
A little bit, huh? Yeah. And so, first question I had to ask out the gate. This is a personal request from Samara. What do you spend your Riot points on?
Oh my goodness! All right. Full disclosure, I'll probably drop like over $200 of my own money on the game I get paid to work on. So lots of gun skins. We'll start with that. Lots of gun skins.
Or are there any gun skins like you're particularly like proud that you grabbed while you got the chance?
Let's see. There is one like theme I love called Glitch Pop. It's almost like cyberpunky neon with like exposed electronics and stuff on the gun, and I just eat that kind of stuff up.
Yeah.
Like, there's a lot of fun designs out there for sure.
And it makes sense even hearing Samara talk about. I'm sure like the guns that like really aesthetically pleasing as well as like they actually function really well. I'm sure those are the guns that really appeal to you, right?
Exactly. It's one thing to have like, your modern camo stuff, but I want the gun that just hovers in your hands while you shoot it. Like you're just psychic. Let me reload this with my mind. It's like it's a game. Let's break the rules of reality.
I love it. I love it. Absolutely. And so I guess before we get into the chat and like start to really ask you about kind of your work as a graphics programmer, could you give us like a brief intro and kind of just tell us a little bit about what you do?
Yeah, sure. So, as Jonathan, you said, my name is Nick Barlow or Nicholas Barlow, but friends call me Nick. I am a software engineer at Riot Games. I've been there for the past almost 2 years now. Before that, I've bounced around the industry, different places. Worked at Microsoft for a good while, Cisco, Philips, even defense contractors for way back when. And yeah, it's fun. All this stuff got me into gaming, graphics, and all this time I've just been chasing doing cool stuff. And absolutely love user interaction, just how people interact with computers and just use computation to just do things that they're not capable of normally. And it turns out video games is a great way to live out those power fantasies. And so there I am.
I love it. Absolutely. That speaks to me too. I love, just being able, I think that's kind of my favorite thing about games are just kind of an extension of our own reality, I think about. Yeah. Awesome.
Absolutely.
And one of the first things I was kind of curious, what was the first video game you played that visually made your jaw drop? And what about it was so special to you?
Oh man, I have a really funny story about this because this game, mind you, this was in 1999. My family got the Sega Dreamcast, and from Blockbuster rented a game called Shenmue.
Oh
This game was just absolutely jaw dropping because this is like a full, human character, and we're recreating like a suburb of like Tokyo, and you're just running through all the houses and hills and petting cats and stuff, and it just felt so real at the time. And it's especially funny because the game was re-released like a couple years ago, and folks who didn't play it hated it, but folks who did play it absolutely loved it. It's so dated for the time now.
right? It's crazy to me because I think about it and I think Shenmue predates GTA 3, which is kind of if you look at them, it's crazy to think just chronologically how that worked. But yeah.
Hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like since then like games have really just there's been a segment of games that really just try to push like reality, physically based rendering, like photorealism, and it's impressive how close we're getting these days.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, all the new engines and everything. Yeah, that Unreal 5 demo is out of this world.
Oh,
um,
there's this one game. Sorry, I'll let you continue.
no.
I'm about to look up this game that's on the tip of my tongue.
Oh yeah, for sure. Feel free to blur it out whenever you're ready. Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah.
So it was a body cam game, and it's like
Oh.
I think the game's called Unrecord, and they
Mhm,
just dropped like a like a gameplay trailer a couple days ago, and
mhm,
it blew up because like a lot of folks like were genuinely fooled between the fisheye and all that. You wouldn't be sure if you're like looking at you're looking at just like real live camera.
mhm. Yeah, I think I saw. I think it was kind of like a like had really realistic like head movements and stuff. Like it looked really natural and like pretty much the whole way the scene was rendered and cameras moved and all that stuff. Yeah, that's awesome. Very cool. And so I guess in your own words, how would you describe graphics programming?
Graphics programming. It's really like the understanding of just like all the stuff that goes into making your pixels show up on screen the way you want them to. Uh, it's the best way to explain it is like you should have an understanding of like the rendering pipeline, just how meshes are represented, what are textures, what's a shader, and how all these things come together, and making your scene, your camera, and combining all that to actually get an output image. Um, there's a lot of like different rabbit holes to get into, like each layer of like the stack. But at the very least, it's how do you get images out of data?
Right, man. That's such a succinct description for such a complex process, right? I love it. That's awesome
It's
though. No.
maddening.
Yeah, I bet. I bet. Oh man. And so with that said, I think I mentioned to you like the graphics programming stuff. It makes me sweat. And so, graphics programming is definitely a specialist field in programming. And so, how did you get like into a graphics programming role? And then, I guess what were you like? Did you have a more generalist time in your career? And how did you like? Are there any like? How did you transition from a generalist into a graphics specialist?
That's a really good question. I am of the mind, or at least through my experience, at least, you rarely see like a junior graphics programmer, just
Mhm,
because it requires like so much disparate knowledge from CPU architecture to like performance optimization and just knowledge of different tools and what have you. And a lot of times or at least I picked up graphics like as a supporting skill to solve certain problems. So like my career originally started, I was a UI programmer, made was it desktop apps and what's it called, WPF, C sharp and what have you. And then from there, like I wanted to get into game development, so picked up Unity, made a side project, and then from there, got a job working in operating systems and started to learn a bit about like just the the OS side to support like your graphics rendering API and all the like hardware technology and what have you. And it was only till like the past like 3 years that I really started getting deep into the weeds of like, okay, what's different lighting calculations? What is like why is memory bandwidth important? And what's like what's a bottleneck as far as like a frame rate? What actually dictates my frame rate? And what are some things in your scene that you should look at to figure that things out?
mhm,
And it's very over it's a lot of things to learn, for sure. But I guess like a lot of folks learn that as a needs to an end.
mhm,
Maybe you want to make a cool VFX, or you want to like learn how to render in light like something that you modeled, and that's the beginning of the journey for a lot of folks.
mhm. Absolutely. Wow. Do you like write shaders alongside with all like any with all the other stuff you do? But do you write shaders?
I've written shaders by hand, yeah.
Yeah.
Thankfully these days there are so many great tools that
Mhm.
you don't have to write the actual shader code,
Right.
unless you're trying to do something really fancy. But like for instance, Blender is a fantastic bit of kit. It has an expressive node-based shading language, and you can make a lot of fancy effects just using nodes and cooking things up. Similarly, I think Unity has their own node-based shader. Unreal has a node-based shader, and that's like the go-to for a lot of like tech artists and just artists to make their own like custom shading effects. And then maybe once you want to do something interesting like write your own like write your own like blur function or like upscale or what have you, then you could start diving into some of the code.
Right.
But
Absolutely.
it's all math.
Yeah. 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 I know. Yeah. Shaders scare me for sure.
It's just multiply and add. It's a majority of what you're doing. Maybe you'll run into a square root or two.
Right. And I guess with that said, are there any shader effects you've seen recently that like blow you away, or any kind of game shader effects? I guess kind of describe. Can you describe shaders? Because I think it. I'm sure non-programmers are like, what are they talking? But
Yeah, I'll try my best to do this as like briefly as possible. So a shader is a program. It takes input and it gives you an output. And you can write shaders to do a lot of different things. It's not necessarily just for rendering, but in the example of like, hey, I want to draw. I have like a model and I want it to color it red. I'm gonna take my pixel shader knows where on screen that I'm drawing, where I'm drawing to, and I can write my program, output the color red. And for each pixel that this shader gets applied to, it will give me red on my screen. It's a very simplistic way of describing it, but the goal is you write these programs, and your GPU is able to run, millions, if not billions, of these programs per second, and that's how you're able to do something fancy like approximate how light hits a surface and bounces and reflects off the mirror and then shows your player character in your mirror.
mm, absolutely, absolutely. I think that's a great description of kind of a general like rendering and shading effect for sure, for sure. Yeah. Very cool. And
Oh, to answer your other question,
oh
I did
yeah,
like some shader effects that I absolutely adore. The tune shader. The tune shader is just
classic.
it defines so many looks.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know if you've ever heard of a stylized station on YouTube. But I watch like their videos all the time. They did a brief breakdown of like the Breath of the Wild shader and how how you get the toon look. How do you transition and get like that soft lighting on the face? How do you do an outline? How do you like get like shiny parts on it? And uh, it's all just math. You know where your lights are. You know where your mesh is. You know how things behave, and that's how you compute how things should look.
Yeah, the whole Discord probably just looked up the YouTube channel you mentioned. I'm sure.
Putting in plugs, man.
That's
And if
awesome.
any tech artists in this Discord want to chat, I'd love to learn more, and we can plug y'all as well.
Oh man. And you mentioned, I guess, kind of with you mentioned like you mentioned so many techniques and kind of things the skills you developed over the years, the things you learned, and I guess I'm kind of curious, like, is with graphics programming being such a specialized skill set, where like alongside that YouTube channel, like, are there any other resources you use to learn more about kind of the latest techniques for any graphics programming or graphics rendering tech?
That's a great question, and it's a question I struggle with every day.
Mhm.
Um, it's similar to like any field where there's just active and ongoing research. The best place to get this knowledge of, I guess, the cutting edge is to learn of who's doing the cutting edge. So one really good resource is GDC. I believe the GDC Vault has free videos, and maybe they might be like 3, 4 years old, but um, graphics has been around for, was it 2023? So 50 years now, maybe even more. So like it's still great to learn about like what are areas that are being explored. There are also conferences, SIGGRAPH, which I'm going to kick myself if I don't go this year. Is a really great place to learn about just rendering techniques in general. GDC, you'll learn about techniques that are being applied to like real-time rendering, like video games and what have you. And yeah, Twitter. Surprisingly, I follow a couple graphics engineers on Twitter, and like one, maybe like they'll have a tweet where they're just like complaining about some tool, and then another day they're just like dropping some knowledge of like, hey, this is how you like compress your vertices to use less memory. Here's some other ways that you can try to minimize bandwidth. This is the difference between like rendering on a phone versus rendering on a computer. It's just like all this is on Twitter. Oh, Mastodon too. If you're in the know, Mastodon's also a lot of like folks who left Twitter. They went there now, and a lot of techies since it's the new social media platform and all that.
Mhm. For sure.
Hopefully that's helpful. It's
Yeah.
there's still just there's books. Tons of books. Let me find my book. Oh, here we go. This guy is more or less the modern graphics programmer's Bible. Real-time rendering fourth. I only got about halfway through it, but it's a pretty big chungus, so we'll make our way through that eventually. But yeah, there's a lot of knowledge, and yeah, I'm still struggling to wrap my mind around all the things that I don't know yet. But it all just comes with practice.
Right. So you talked about the math kind of used, like, and math is obviously a big part of your job. Are there any really creative applications of math you've used to pull off like a certain visual effect or a rendering effect that you'd like to talk about, or?
This isn't necessarily a rendering effect, but this was a problem that I ran into working on Chosen Fate. May she rest in peace. But long story short, we had a rig, a character rig, and that's for those who don't know, it's just the different bones of your character that tell it where its arms and legs are. And they were animated to a given rig, and we realized that we needed to change it in order to allow us to control different parts of it. So it may have been missing a spine, so that we could actually like flex properly at the spine. We had to add extra bones such they can carry like equipment. The equipment can move independent of stuff. And when you animate a bunch of stuff and you animate to a certain rig, if you change the hierarchy of bones, the animations may not align to that new orientation of those bones. So the process of taking animation and allowing it to play or allowing it to stay, I guess, visually equivalent, given like a different bone hierarchy, is called retargeting. So I had to write a retargeter in Blender for my particular like skeleton,
Mhm.
and that way we're able to save like weeks, months of animations. Just like there's one thing to ask your anime, hey, like those 25 things you animated. Well, can you do it again?
Right.
It's a terrible thing to ask.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. I think probably the at my last job, kind of the equivalent to something like that we described as like, I guess, the lead engineer would call it the T-Rex problem, right? And so like, having a rig for something like a T-Rex, small arms, versus trying to reuse the same rig for like King Kong, which massive arms, right? And I can only imagine kind of what you would have to do to even kind of, I mean, position, right? And to try to calculate like retargeting in that way. Yeah, that's wild. Yeah.
All matrix math.
Man.
We're
Also
gonna go back to this a lot through this conversation.
yeah. Here, yeah, but very cool. Very cool. Oh man, that's super cool, man. Awesome. And then, I guess the other side of being a specialist, right, is like, I'm sure that there's kind of there's probably a language to like working in the rendering space, right? And kind of the tools that you use. And so with that said, like I'm sure kind of moving from like a more generalist nature into a specialist nature, there's probably certain habits and approaches you might have had to unlearn. And so like what about Like, is there any kind of generalist mindsets or thoughts or any of that stuff you had to kind of leave behind once you became specialized in rendering?
Mm, That is a good question. At the end of the day, I do feel I'm still, software engineering. I feel I've had similar experience working in a software engineering team on Windows as I did working on Valorant. Of course, the tools, the mission, all that are different, but a lot of the practices of writing quality code, being able to test your code, being able to define, being able to take requirements and implement them. The practice is very much the same. As far as like maybe some practices I've had to unlearn is sometimes you have to be okay with good enough. And it pains me to say that. The perfectionist in me is just like, well, no, we do it right, we do it perfectly. But sometimes there's a margin of error that's acceptable, especially for like non-critical applications where if you solve the problem and you solve it for 99% of cases and you know what that 1% is and you can define that clearly, then that may be worth spending an additional 50% of your time trying to solve it for that last case.
Right.
Uh, Also, I don't know if this thing's in focus, but yeah, it's also another really funny example of good enough.
Yeah. Could you describe it, or could you talk about it? Or
Sure. So, let me know if you're familiar with the fast inverse square root.
no.
Okay. So the inverse square root is useful because it's used in a reflection calculation. I believe it helps you get like the incident, or yeah, it helps you calculate your incident angle. I'm sure if there's another graphics engineer in this call, they can call me out on my BS. But the reason why this is interesting is because this is a very expensive thing to do computationally. Um, it's the fast inverse square root is like a hack of floating point and integer math, where if you take a magic number and you subtract that from the int representation of your number, you get something really close to half the inverse
Oh,
of the square root. And that's you go from something that might be like multiple instructions, like multiple like multiply or divide instructions, or if you on like a different architecture, you may have like a square root instruction, but it's like really long. To you're just doing a subtraction,
right,
and that's way faster.
right,
And imagine doing that for all the pixels of your screen.
right. Absolutely. I could. That kind of makes sense. I kind of. I know when I worked on mobile games, kind of. One of the big no-nos was don't divide, like don't divide if you're going to do it like in a function, because that's just such a slow calculation. The better thing is to like multiply against the inverse of the thing you're going to divide against, right? So better to multiply against half than divide by two. And yeah, so I think it's kind of a similar mindset, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like
Mhm.
we try to avoid square root by like using, or we'll pre-compute the log of something,
Right.
and you'll use that and reuse that, and adjust like your math to like avoid doing expensive things like fraction was it fractional exponents. There we go.
Mhm. Wow. Mhm. Man, absolutely. Yeah, and I hope like the math. I was about to say. Oh, okay. We got some people. I was about to say. I hope we didn't lose people because I know math. My math can only go so deep. If we talk math, you're gonna lose me eventually. So,
Oh,
um,
trust. I'm like almost at the end of my depth as well.
oh, pretty good, pretty good. Yeah, that's awesome. And so, I guess as far as is there anything kind of on the horizon that excites you kind of in the graphics programming space? Is there anything like that you're excited to kind of explore in the next few years or
What excites me in graphics programming?
Mhm,
As I said before, like this push towards real-time realism.
mhm,
I don't know if you're familiar with in RTX or RDNA, and they're like what's it called? I think they have a it's more or less like you can use a deep neural net to approximate like real-time ray tracing, or you can use deep neural net to approximate like a realistic rendering, and you can kind of bake down a lot of like the parameters of like your surface and like some of the different lighting calculations into something faster to compute, and that kind of powers like real-time ray tracing, which gives you like originally reflections and reflections, fog, and what have you. All of this was done like algorithmically.
Mhm.
But if you can speed up these computations, you can do way more fancy things, like have real puddles, like have like real water, or at least real acting water. Um, and so as like just some of our technological advances happen, like they filter into gaming, and we tend to like it seems sometimes it feels like gaming technology moves really slowly, but then sometimes it feels like it moves like really quickly as far as like what adoptions we adopt and what doesn't.
Right. Absolutely. Wow. Um, wow. So kind of like exploring more like just kind of real time rendering in general, right? Just for just
I
as like a
think
school.
Yeah, I think real-time rendering is going to be really interesting. I think real-time compositing and like live deep faking is also going to be a very powerful and honestly very dangerous area of technology that's going to be more and more available.
Mhm.
I don't know if you ever used like FaceRig, but things like that blow me away. Where just using your webcam,
Mhm.
we can do like facial tracking. Oh, of
Mhm.
course, like was it Snapchat also does it really well. Like they're
Right.
they're pretty much the masters of that stuff.
Mhm.
And you can composite your face with like an anime face, or you can composite with like a dragon breathing fire, like as I saw at the Seattle Sea Dragons game the other day. It's an XFL team, by the way. But it's hilarious. Like now they have like cameras in the crowd, and then like they detect a bunch of faces, and they'll just put a dragon on it and breathing fire. I'm like, this is awesome.
Right. Man. And now and this like makes me I'm so curious, right? Like so kind of going back to what you described about like, using math to make it possible to retarget a rig, right? Like for any kind of like face tracking or body tracking stuff or anything that kind of has to do with tracking along the human body, what kind of math is involved in that process? Like um
That's a really good question. I believe for most like modern face tracking, this is done through like deep neural networks. And so you'll be able to like identify different facial features, and you should be able to track where they are like relative to like the face. So you should be able to identify like when your mouth is moving, what parts of what pixels are your eyes and what have you. This is we're starting to get out of my personal depth, but I think this is like my next area of study. Where if I ever get tired of like gaming and supporting live services and what have you, we're probably going into research because just the things that you can do these days, just with these GPUs, massively parallel computational devices, is just mind blowing.
Very cool. Oh man, that's awesome. And I'm kind of with the AI apocalypse on us. I'm sure it's gonna grow. The need for those kind of developers are gonna grow even more so.
That's
Mhm.
another really interesting area too. Is just
Mhm.
as we've seen with Mid Journey and different like 2D, I guess what's the good word? Image generation tools.
Mhm.
Um, it's really interesting tech, because at this like we now have we're almost going to like replace. I don't even want to say replace, but we're creating tooling that makes concept creation much easier. It used to be, you'll have a concept artist and you give them a couple hours and they'll draw up like an idea of what you're thinking of.
Right.
But these days, you can just like tweak some parameters and just keep regenerating in a neural using one of these image generation tools, and you can get somewhere around what you're thinking of,
Mhm.
and then you can pass that off to a concept artist to refine within line with like your art style and
Right.
what you're really trying to go for with your game and get everything uniform and all that. And the faster this turnaround is, the easier it is for like smaller teams to make more impactful work, or at least like larger projects. Like you can make
Mhm.
impactful. Like Dwarf
Mhm.
Fortress is small and impactful. You
Mhm.
know.
That's true. That's true. Yeah. The most brilliant ASCII game ever, right? Yeah.
Mm.
uh, Very cool. All right, and that actually plays really well into the next question, which is kind of about like studio size, right, and the needs for rendering engineers. And so, usually when you see openings for studios that need rendering engineers, the companies are kind of mid to large end on the spectrum in terms of like general studio size. And so, with that said, do you think that there's room for small studios to have like graphics specialists, or do you think that's something that should be reserved for like bigger studios and kind of bigger projects?
As far as, let's say, like one person whose job is just make sure the game looks good. Um, I think in a smaller studio, that person's going to wear a lot more hats. Like, you're not just going to be like the rendering specialist. Like, you might also be the tech artist, or you might also be the performance engineer, or you might also be the platform engineer. You may head up like porting efforts, depending on how small your studio is and whether or not you want to outsource that work. Um, it's like the more people that you have towards like a given initiative, the more specialized you can be as far as your function. So like for instance, like my current responsibilities at Riot revolve around like making sure that anything in the game that we depend on in Unreal Engine is handled. So we have like multiple teams that they have engine knowledge. We modify the engine, we change things, but it's like now we have a team of 4 folks to specialize in different components. So maybe we want to change the particle system one day. Maybe we need like a certain feature, like need a custom shader for a certain feature. Maybe we're seeing like performance degradation in like the UI. We need to fix that. And so like that's where you can really dive in because game engines are gigantic. Graphics is a very vast field, and if you are an effective graphics engineer, like you're an effective like software engineer, you're an effective low level programmer, you're an effective debugger. Like there's no, it's very easy to go from special to general, and maybe there's a little context switching needed, but yeah, I feel every day I'm doing something different. Every sprint is something else.
Oh, for sure, absolutely, very cool. And kind of to what you just said, like, would you consider yourself almost? To me, it sounds like you must do some engine level programming, right, in order to kind of uh, pull your job off. Is that fair to say, or?
Yeah, that's really fair to say.
Awesome. Very cool. And so do you have to like do you dive into like the Unreal source code? Like how do you approach like how well do you have to know Unreal to do your job?
That's a really good question. I think Unreal has a few nice things going for it in that one, it's open source. So there is like distributed knowledge either in like, other people, existing documentation. And so I feel I don't necessarily need to know the ins and out of every component of Unreal, but I do feel whenever there's a specific problem to solve, that's when I need to dive in and understand how something works. So usually it's at this point it's kind of like issue driven, like what I learn or what we're trying to do, and maybe there's like knowledge gaps as far as like oh, we don't quite know how the render pipeline works. Let's figure that out, and we need to change this to suit our purposes. So a lot of the research is driven by need versus like like I have like my fundamentals to lean on as far as like okay, I need to add a new parameter to a given shader. Let me find where we represent the uniform buffer. And now the problem is, okay, how the hell does Unreal's uniform buffer get generated?
Right.
Why were all these classes go into the generate? Okay, fine. It's more like that's when you start getting to application specific knowledge.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's fascinating to hear you talk. A good friend of mine, like Ray Batts, he works at Bethesda as well, and he's also a graphics engineer. And I just even seen the job descriptions. Like I've had recruiters hit me up for like graphics rendering roles, and like right off the bat, I'm always like, no, that's not me. I'm not that guy.
You would
Respect.
be surprised.
You think so?
Um, I've chatted with rendering engineers at Microsoft where maybe they'll have like C++ knowledge and not a lick of graphics knowledge. And a lot of like graphics is tribal. You'll pick that up as you go, or you'll chat with folks who do know the specific things. And like every day you'll learn a new bag of tricks, and once you
Mhm.
have a big enough bag, that's when you can start to flex.
Right.
But it's like at the end of the day, I'm still a C++ programmer, and that's my major job function.
Mhm. For sure, for sure. Well, that's encouraging. Yeah, and I see that Chad Prescott told me to believe in myself, so I'm going to believe in myself. That maybe I can do it. Yeah. um, yeah, and so I guess when it comes to like working with a small team, do you think small teams should make certain compromises when if they're bringing on a graphic specialist? Or do you think there's ever a situation where the team should kind of focus their design skills around like a graphics specialist role? Like, do you think that happens in a project often, or do
That's
you
a
think that happens?
good question. So, if I understand the question, we're saying like, does or should a project be tailored to the need of a graphics specialist, or is there a specific time when you need a graphics specialist? I guess that's
Yeah,
the question.
that's the good. I mean, I think it's a little bit of both, right? I think it's kind of like if a small team, I guess they want to do something unique when it comes to rendering, right?
Mhm.
What should they know if they want to bring on a graphic specialist? And then if they do bring on a graphic specialist, is there anything they could do to make the workflow easier to work with them?
So that's a really good question. So it's funny because like as I said before, like on a smaller team, like your graphics specialist might be a combination of your tech artist. So like maybe you're working on actual art assets. They may also be your engine programmer, where they're actually like modifying or providing the functionality that you need for your assets to be displayed. They may be a pipeline engineer, where they're working on tools and technologies for the art assets to get into your engine that you're using. And it's like the smaller the team, the more broad your responsibilities may become as a graphics specialist. Like you may not just wear one hat of, oh, all I do is just write DirectX 11 interface code. I just implement or I just write shaders in HLSL. That might not be like the only thing you do. Um, so it's tough. I will say, like, as far as like roles that do that, that's like maybe like you're uh you got to have a lot of need to not go with an off-shelf solution as far as like engine technologies go. I would argue that majority of small teams have no business with custom engines.
Right. I
Um,
agree.
and of course, like there's going to be situations where that's not true. Like for instance, one project that comes to mind is Starbound. I don't know if you remember this game. It was like a 2D exploration game in the vein of like Terraria. And I believe Terraria also, where both of these games needed their own custom lighting solution, and they ended up just writing their own engine from scratch because it was a 2D game, relatively simple physics, no need for fancy things like reflections, and they just needed like fancy pixel lighting effects, and they needed to be able to do that with like this dynamic changing voxelized world. uh, and that's where it's like if you have like unique need, that's going to drive unique tech. But if you're making, let's say, like I don't know, 2D fighter, maybe you might not have need for a graphics specialist. Maybe you might have need for like networking specialist if you're trying to do something networked.
Right.
And so the project always drives the person.
Right.
Um, so like I'd say situations where you may want to consider like getting graphic specialist is uh, if you have custom visual effects that you may want. That's when you want to look at a tech artist, or like somebody who has understanding of shaders and can create VFX. If you have specific rendering performance issues that you need to figure out, that's when a graphic specialist is useful, because there are a lot of pieces that go into rendering performance. Everything from triangle count, texture count, to shader complexity. All these things can drive like how many FPS you get at the end of the day. And it is your rendering engineers like it's their responsibility to help uh, extract those parameters that we can try to tune for. So Maybe like, maximizing FPS isn't the goal, then maybe we can think of, oh, well, here's some fancy effects we can try using the game. Or if your goal is we want this game to run as fast as possible on as many different SKUs of game as possible, well, now we'll think about, okay, well, maybe we want to add different levels of detail and different quality levels to the game. What are the implications of that? What are our budgets? How do we set that? How many triangles should we use in a player model? How big should our textures be if we want to get these rendering targets? And so that's a rendering engineer's like goal. I'm sorry, I'm seeing the chat. The term came from basketball. I don't know if you got like got in his bag.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, right. Um, Yeah, no, and that totally makes sense. That and I kind of like what you said, right? Like you're talking about scope, right? That's really what we're talking about at the end of the day, right? And being able to scope out project needs, like what are our needs, what is kind of I think about like what's your game secret sauce, like where do we need to put more of our effort versus less of our effort. And even that kind of goes back to what you were saying earlier about like, there's a point where there's good enough. And like I think a lot of what you're kind of describing is just knowing your limits, really, right? Like, and working within them, right? Getting in your bag, so to speak, right?
Exactly.
Very cool.
Yeah, everything's connected. I wish there was like, like 5 things I could tell you to make your game faster, but it all depends on what you want to do.
Absolutely. Yeah, that makes sense. Very cool. Um, okay, I'm gonna save my questions. Yeah, because I think I'm gonna have to open it up soon. So, so the next one is that are there any recent game whose rendering techniques particularly interested you?
Games that so we talked before, unrecorded is it's like a really I think this is like a high point as far as like modern real-time rendering effects. They're really trying to push the envelope. I was a huge fan of Cyberpunk. That game was absolutely gorgeous. It ran at like 40 FPS on my 3070. I bought a new car just so I could play it at like, something acceptable when it first launched. I'm sure they spent some time improving it, but that game, it's a gorgeous game. They spent a lot of time making things look really good. I'm a huge fan of stylized games. Samara's gonna love. I absolutely adore Arc System Works, like their whole catalog. They have mastered the anime toon shaded look. I can just rail off. Guilty Gear is just fantastic. It's a triumph of just auteur driven game design. Everything in that game just it just oozes style. It looks fantastic. There their workflow and how they manage to replicate the look of their 2D sprites in 3D and make them look even better and allow them like even more flexibility as far as like speeding up animation time, reducing like they used to need like thousands of frames, individual pictures to make their game, and now you make a model and you animate it. I mean, it's not that simple, but you get the idea.
Oh man.
uh, I'm just a huge fan of like games that really try to do weird stuff. Way back when, I absolutely loved Mad World as well. That was another game that just really went for a striking black and white comic book look. Killer 7 and a lot of the what was his name, Suda 51 titles as well. They were fantastic looking games, and they also were just as weird as they were beautiful.
Yeah, No More Heroes is on my playlist. I still need to dive into those games. Yeah.
And that's just the cool thing about like games these days is that it's easier than ever to make something that looks good. It no longer takes like expensive assets to make like beautiful games, and that's the kind of future I want to go towards.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, that makes sense. A beautiful future, right? Yeah. And then I guess on the flip side of that, are there any games that you would have liked to have pushed the envelope a bit more terms in kind of their graphics tech or kind of their rendering tech, right? Like
Yeah.
the example I have is like great lighting but poor style, or anything similar to that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. One game that really comes to mind is the re-release of Advance Wars 1 and 2.
Mm-hmm.
I loved those games, and I think the original Game Boy Advance games, like, they pushed like pixel art and they made their characters really expressive. I don't know if you've seen like they redesigned them a little bit in Dual Strike, and that was like the third game in their series, and they just looked absolutely fantastic. Like it was like halfway from like anime to real person, and
Mm-hmm.
it felt like they really hit their Man, I know Atlas the publisher. The actual studio doesn't come to mind right now, but they really hit their stride as far as like design goes. And in the re-release, it feels like they didn't quite hit the mark for me at least.
For
I really wish they try to adapt the pixel style similarly to like how Arxis like adapted their pixel style because they could have made something absolutely gorgeous.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah, I was a little disappointed. I was a big fan of Dual Strike 2, and like visually, I this new one, like I'm gonna grab it because I love Advance Wars, but I just
Same.
it doesn't hit the same, like just visually. Yeah. For sure, absolutely. Any other examples of like games that you kind of wish pushed the envelope a little bit harder, or?
Let's see. Uh, What is a good example of a game that pushed it harder? I think like so when Monster Hunter World dropped, that game was absolutely gorgeous. And Rise, it's still a fantastic looking game, but I can tell like, just like since, originally the game was originally designed to run as well as possible on a Tegra X1. That's the Nintendo Switch processor if you don't know. But and that drove a lot of the art direction as far as like, we're going to use simplified models. We're not going to, like we're going to save most of our budget for the hunter and the character, not so much for the environment.
Mhm.
Versus World, where it's this absolute lush, you're running through a jungle, you're running through like craggy mountain with like, lava beneath your feet. And it's a little, I was hoping that like for the port to computer and more powerful platforms, they may have tried to like do a minor remaster or upscaling, what have you. But it's still a cool, still a cool game. Very
For
cool
sure.
game.
Right. Very cool. Yeah, no, that makes sense. I didn't realize that they were kind of targeting the Switch's processor with their art. It makes total sense for Rise. But yeah, but World is such a beautiful game. It kind of makes sense why there's that visual drop between the two. Yeah.
hmm I'm about to just pull up my Steam. I got a
Um,
lot of games I love.
and then I think I did want to ask, what do you think is the next in terms of graphics technology for games? Right. I know you talked about kind of your own passion for like working more on real time rendering stuff, but do you think there's something beyond that that's like the far future, like on the horizon, or?
What is next for graphics in games? I think like the right now, a lot of the tech developments I'm seeing is like, how can you get the same kind of real-time fidelity but with less manual labor? If you've seen some of the developments of Unreal 5, like a lot of their like headline features, Nanite, which is it's more or less automated law generation, like on the fly, and so now you may not necessarily need to go through the whole multiple LOD, full sculpt, low poly bake workflow just to get something that doesn't absolutely tank your frame rate. We're able to. They have technology that allows you to generate those like normal maps and what have you from an abstraction of the mesh geometry, and that's really cool because now you can theoretically. I haven't tested it myself, but take a high poly sculpt and use that as your live asset. Of course, it's going to be a big thing, but once you extract like the details of that surface, now they already do the low poly like workflow for you. And so that's really cool. Lumen as well is going to make like making real-time lighting, dynamic real-time lighting, a lot easier to do. A lot of times, like you're limited to, in a real-time workflow, you would place all your static elements, you would bake the lighting of all those static elements, and you might not be able to like kick over a barrel in your scene, or that barrel won't have like diffuse reflections going into the scene if it's hit by really bright light. And so like just making more fancy lighting effects doable in real time is going to allow like way more dynamic things to happen in your game, and things still look like photoreal and fantastic. Um, Another, and this is may not be necessarily like graphics related, but another game that I'm going to like name drop and stand hard for is it's called The Finals. And this is just to set the scene. It's like Apex, but destructibility is like a major gameplay element. So you're on a team. It's a battle royale, but now instead of going around this building, you can blow a hole in it, and you can go take them out that way. And it's just I'm loving. I used to play like Red Faction way back when I was younger, and that was one of those games that just blew my mind. As far as if I wanted to, I could take this sledgehammer and take this whole building down board by board. And we're seeing games that try to do that again, and I'm really excited to see like this where it's not like the primary gameplay element, but we still have destructible environments. I think Battlefield also used to really lean into destructibility as well.
Yeah, I'm a big Battlefield fan, and I think Bad Company was the first game I played where you could level a house, and I would just sit there and just clear out all the enemies and just get my rocket launcher and just bomb the building until it was dust, basically. That's dope. Yeah, and I'm gonna check out the finals. That sounds perfect for me. Yeah.
Looks cool. I think they're about to get into like open beta soon, so once that happens, I'm definitely about to hop in and play it.
Very cool. Oh man. Dope. And so that's the last of my questions. And so the last question I have for you before we open up the Q&A is like, do you want to plug your socials, and do you want to tell everybody where they can follow you?
Oh yeah. I think I have an account on most major social media, but let's see. You can find me at Nick Lobar. We just spent the past week and a half like renaming all my social accounts so that they're consistent. So I'm on Twitter, Insta, Mastodon, wherever else that you can share your inner machinations of your mind. Yeah, give me a follow, and I'll be happy to chat, especially for folks that are interested in learning a bit more about graphics or showing off cool stuff. That's why I got into this industry for. So drop me a line.
I love it. And if he says it, then do it, y'all, because I think not everybody is open to receiving that kind of commentary. So please do follow up with Nick if you can. And so, with that said, thank you for joining us, Nick. This was a really insightful fireside chat. And you taught us a lot, me especially, like, man. And maybe one day, far in the future, I'll apply for a graphics programming role. You made me believe in myself for a little bit. We'll see.
Maybe in the future, we'll start getting into that game development, getting some of that game design, man. That's the secret sauce. Like making something fun is an art all of itself.
Oh, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And so, yeah, we'd like to open up the chat for questions. If you have one and haven't already asked, feel free to post your question in the fireside chat. And then, so yeah, now it's user questions time.
Yeah, starting off, Tim had a really good question.
Yeah.
How do I see the current and evolving AI tech crossing into my graphics work for game dev? So that's a good question. For instance, like conversational AI tools are really good at asking technical, or they're getting really good at answering technical questions. Like, say I'm unfamiliar with like a certain lighting algorithm, like I was like, hey, what's like a distance field and how's that used in lighting? It can actually give you a coherent answer. I've asked it about Unreal internals and specifics about that. It's like, hey, what's this class used for? And it might not always be right. Sometimes they make up stuff, but you can get an idea of how to like navigate large public code bases. Like I have no doubt that if you ask like ChatGPT about the Linux kernel, it will give you a good answer.
Mm-hmm.
So that's as far as like me as like a developer. I think there's also room for using artificial intelligence for validation work. Um, One interesting area is render validation. How do you know that something looks right? And currently, the state of the art is take a picture of a working state and compare your current state to the working state. So there may be areas of exploration of figuring out when artifacting happens, like maybe seeing if like animations are like broken, and other than like stepping through individual frames in animation and taking like image captures, I'm sure like there is some room for what's it called, adversarial AI as far as like validation work as well. We've also chatted a bit earlier about like AI for asset generation. This is more for like an artist workflow, but I can totally see. Uh, I don't think I don't think there's a world where you can. I mean, maybe this is just me being naive of the state of the art, but the way I see it, it takes so much work getting AI to give you something like stylistically like consistent with previous generations, at least like given like currently available stuff. Uh, you're still gonna need an artist to get like an artist's job is to be able to express a certain style,
Right.
and AIs are not good at being consistent with their expressions.
Right. I can absolutely say that. Absolutely. Um, Very cool. Um, and so this is a question from earlier. KP asked earlier. You mentioned writing shaders to highlight players behind walls, etc. How often do you interface with design on that type of stuff?
That's a really good question. Very often. Usually I'm the person that a designer would go to if things don't look right. Like for instance, maybe there's a piece of content that doesn't look as expected, and my job will be chatting with the designer, understanding what the issue is, understanding what the constraints are as far as like how difficult would this be to fix, is this a feature that exists, how much work may it be to add this new feature. So like let's say like the designer is like the angel on one shoulder being like, yeah, do all this cool stuff. I'm like the devil on the other shoulder, like, hey, is this performant? Is this actually feasible? Can we really do this? So I do feel like sometimes you're expected to be like the pragmatist, bring everyone down to what is actually doable.
Right. I can totally see that. I think one of my favorite stories is about the Spider-Man designers and kind of the budget between like how good does Spider-Man need to look swinging, how performant does he need to be when he's swinging, how much do we want the effect of the blur to happen when he's swinging? Like there's just so many. There's like it's a dance, right, to figure out what
Mhm.
the finished thing is. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Hmm.
Yeah, and that's like gaming is it's a multidisciplinary field.
Hmm.
Like you're not going to get nearly as far with just one area, be it programming or just art or what have you, without folks who have different specialties.
Hmm.
The best team has folks of all walks of life, and they can provide context, help you like help you write things that are like like genuine, and it's all about just folks who work well
Yeah.
and complement each other.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
Is there
Absolutely.
any major distinction between graphics slash rendering engineer and tech artist? Yes, there is a distinction. I've at least like the distinction I come around to is a rendering engineer works on foundational technology. So the rendering engineer works on or at least like the engineering portion is implementation of tools, procedures, or guidelines in order to get whatever kind of visual look that you desire, with whatever sort of requirements you desire. Tech artist similarly does that. I think it's more specialized as far as like using tools, procedures, or processes to create the assets that you desire. So like a rendering engineer will focus more on engine and foundational components. The tech artist will work more on pipeline and the actual assets that are needed. or working on tools to empower the artist to create the assets that you need. Hopefully that's useful. I'm trying to. There's a lot of overlap, and I've gone into job interviews where the listings for a graphics engineer, and it turns out they really want a tech artist, and vice versa. So your mileage may vary.
That's wild. Yeah. Do you interface with the tech artists a lot when you in your jobs? Like,
Quite a lot. So the tech artists that I work with, they're really smart folks. They know more about lighting and shader effects than I do. And it's kind of fun, like where I'll be the one that's like, okay, so and then in Unreal we can do this, this, and that. These may be the parameters that we use to control these certain systems, and they might be like, well, it's like we still want to get like this particular like lighting effect. I'll try to mess around with these parameters until I can get something that I like. And it might be like, hey, I need a new parameter. And I'll be like, all right, let's try to add it.
very cool. Very cool. That's awesome. Very cool. And Wildcard Mar asks, what is the best way to get a career in game development? And kind of general, but like, what would your
Very general.
be on that?
Right. You can be a security guard working at a game company. It's all need based. What is the best way? The best way is looking at openings. Look at openings and tailor your skills to what people need. Figure out what area that you want to be. Figure out what where you want to go in your career, and figure out what skills you need to learn to get there. So say you want to be a rendering engineer like me, maybe look at some graphics engineer openings, see what kind of requirements they ask for. It's like, oh, you need familiarity with graphics profiling. What are profiling tools? Let me try to use one. You need familiarity with DirectX. How do I use DirectX? Let me make an application that uses that. If you want to get into UI, like every game needs UI. Every game needs artists. Every game needs sound designers. Every game needs operational folks. Every game needs it needs like business administrators. These are companies much like others, and the larger the company, the more specific the need. Hopefully that's a useful guide. But I would start with where do you want to be? Do you want to be a gameplay engineer? Do you want to be a tools designer? Do you want to be a tech artist? Do you want to be a rendering engineer? And from there, you can plot out your career. And for sure, you'll find if you ground your expectations in what is needed in the industry, then you'll definitely find an opening for yourself.
Very cool. Very cool. And so Abba asked this question, and I think it's actually really interesting. So he posted a video, but really, I guess the question is, are games getting too realistic? And I think it kind of aligns with the question I had earlier this year about grew up in the Mortal Kombat days. Scorpion rips off his face, blows fire, melts somebody, they turn to a pile of bones. In 1992, that was horrific, right? The Congress was basically holding trials and whatnot. But then if you look at Mortal Kombat 11, and like some of those fatalities are like, I grew up on this stuff, and I'm like, those, oof, that goes hard. Like that makes my neck hurt seeing what you just
did. Those
right?
shatters.
right. And so I guess with that said, I'm kind of curious, like, do you think that there is an issue with maybe graphics rendering becoming too realistic?
That's a good question. I think this leans a bit into like I guess like ethics of like is art that's too realistic, like is that problematic? Like if I make like a snuff film like of a depiction of something incredibly gory and violent, is that wrong? I don't think I'm smart enough to talk about the ethics of things like that, but at the very least, what I can say is that it's the most critical part of enjoying any sort of like work is the disassociation. The moment that you believe that something fictional is real is the moment that you've been to an extent propagandized. You've been manipulated, and I think in the coming days, as like different sources of disinformation, different works, deep fakes and what have you become more prevalent, this is only going to become more of an issue where folks are going to use technology to create depictions of things that may be real. I guess like is I guess the disassociation for me is I'm always choosing to play games. I always make that active decision. Like if I'm going to play something ultra violent, this is my decision to do so. If I'm going to watch like, a super violent movie, like that's my active decision to do so. Um, and that's where I mark my disassociation is at any moment I can choose to get out of this. Uh, and hopefully that's helpful. It's a bit of a sidestep of the question because I think this is inevitability. Like folks, given any sort of like a medium, folks will always try to push it to its extent. Folks will use the medium to make offensive works, and folks will use the medium to propagandize. And I guess as like informed consumers, it's our job to be aware of when all this is happening.
Man. No, I don't think you sidestepped the question at all. I think it's a really nuanced question, and I think you gave a really nuanced answer. And so, thank you. I appreciate you for your candor. Yeah, I think are those all the questions? I want to ask. Going once, going twice, and I'm okay. All right, sold. And so, with that being the last of the questions, thank you, everybody. Our Black and Gaming community team wants to say thank you for hanging out with us tonight. We hope you learned something and hope to see you at the next Fireside chat. Thank you so much for joining us, Nick. This is super informative, and I appreciate it.
Thank you, Jonathan. This was a lot of fun. Thanks for having me on. I'm looking forward to the next folks that you bring on. This is an awesome space that you created, and I'm honored to be a part of it.
Oh yeah, just a member of the team. Thank you to the big
Oh,
team.
you and everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And so with that, everybody have a good night. Sometimes people hang out in the chat and chill channel, so that's feel free to if you want to or not. But just wanted to throw it out there. And so yeah. With that said, everybody have a good night.